On va attaquer la partie scientifique et enrichissement, on va dire, culturel. On a la chance aujourd'hui d'accueillir Nancy Grimm. Nancy, elle est dans notre comité scientifique international. C'est la première chose. Elle nous vient des États-Unis. Elle est écologue. Elle est professeure à l'Université d'État d'Arizona à Phoenix. Moi, je l'ai connue plus particulièrement sur ses aspects biogéochimie. C'est une des meilleures spécialistes de la biogéochimie des cours d'eau en milieu aride, donc des cours d'eau intermittents, ce qui est quelque chose que j'aime bien. Et c'est vraiment une référence dans le milieu cycle du carbone, de l'azote, dans les cours d'eau urbains en contexte aride. Je ne peux pas résumer toute sa carrière parce que ça prendrait beaucoup de temps, mais sachez qu'elle a été pendant 20 ans directrice d'un LTER à Phoenix, très interdisciplinaire, sciences de l'environnement, SHS, sur l'évolution d'un socio-écosystème, incluant les cours d'eau. Elle est aujourd'hui co-directrice d'un réseau national de recherche également interdisciplinaire sur la résilience des villes face aux événements météorologiques extrêmes. Et je pense que c'est en partie ce qu'elle va nous présenter dans la demi-heure qui vient. Donc, on a vraiment la chance de la voir. Merci, Nancy. And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Je ne parle le français, ni entends le français, so you have to tell me if he said something nice about me. Did he? Okay, very good. So you'll also have to listen to my talk in English. And I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak to you. As Thibaut, I think, said, I'm on the scientific committee, but this is the first time I've interacted with this group. And I have to say, from the introductions that we heard earlier, I'm very impressed with all of the excellent work that's going on, and hope that maybe some of the things I'm going to tell you today will resonate with the work you're starting to do. So the work I'm going to present today lies at the intersection of climate change and extreme events with urbanization and urban systems. So my training and expertise are in aquatic and urban ecosystem science, but as you'll see, I collaborate across many disciplines. And I'll try to acknowledge my many collaborators as we go, but mention them as a group here. You can see the logos at the bottom, the Central Arizona Phoenix LTER, Natura, the SETS Convergence Project, and the UREX Sustainability Research Network. And so if you hear of any great ideas, they probably came from these collaborations. So I'm going to begin by just reminding us, which I don't think I need to remind you, of the big challenges we're facing in this world of rapid change. And in the second part, I'll talk about how we have conceived of building resilience for cities, in particular adopting a framework for social, ecological, technological systems, and by co-creating future scenarios with practitioners and researchers across 9 cities. And then from those scenarios, it's really more of a bird's eye view, but I'll highlight some of the diverse strategies that have come out of that. And then I'm going to dive into a case study in Phoenix, showing you first that water is really everything that defines this desert city. I'll talk about flooding in this region of the southwestern US and water scarcity and its relationship to vegetation in the city and thereby heat mitigation. And then spend a lot of time on the scenarios that we created in Phoenix. So asking what goals and strategies do Phoenicians envision. And I want to just end by telling you about the Natura network of networks. So as you all know, we live in challenging times, and I'm sure you've seen these graphs where on the left, the nonlinear change in the activities of people are driving nonlinear change in the Earth system. And so we live in this rapidly changing world. But what this doesn't show is the importance of feedbacks within the Earth system, which include people. For example, the rise of surface temperature drives energy use and water use. The degradation of the terrestrial biosphere is driving urban population growth and migration from rural areas to the cities. So the novel qualities that emerge from interacting parts of this complex system mean that the system is seeing increased complexity, that is, complexity of the system itself and the complexity of the problems that we're facing. There also is increased inequity, for example, with rising disparities between the global north and the global south, and within nations, particularly mine, widening inequality. And then finally, there's increased uncertainty. And one clear case that we understand well is this non-stationarity problem, where probabilities of extreme events are changing over time, so we can no longer use the past to predict the future. We need to think about new ways of dealing with that uncertainty and planning under uncertainty. So my team has been working in urban ecosystems, so my talk today is coming from that perspective. In our world, most people live in cities, and most people are experiencing climate change through the occurrence of extreme events in those cities. Cities are particularly vulnerable to extreme events, given their location in coastlines and in inland areas that are arid, lacking water, but also because they concentrate both people and infrastructure. And the world is rapidly urbanizing. Most of this century's population growth will be in cities, and most of that will be in the less developed world. Thus, the intersection between urbanization and climate change, especially extreme events, makes it really important for us to ask how we can build resilience in our cities to those increased frequency, perhaps, and definitely magnitude and impact of extreme events. So with this background, in 2015, we established this network called Urban Resilience to Extreme Sustainability Research Network, or UREX, to research how to build resilience to extreme events. And we focused on 4 types of extreme events that you see at the top there: coastal flooding, extreme heat, drought, and urban flooding. Recognizing that the event type is an important driver of response and varies among cities. We had 9 cities in this network, including Latin American cities, to understand the cultural values that might underpin responses. And this is a highly interdisciplinary team. So in each of the cities, we had a city team consisting of at least one ecologist, at least one social scientist, at least one engineer in the research side, and then practitioners from city and other entities. Key advances from this work include the SETS framing, about which I will spend some time: social, ecological, technological systems, and then the co-production with these city teams of 60 future scenarios. So why a SETS perspective? What has been really governing the way that infrastructure is built, the way that we deal with things like floods, extreme heat, and so forth, is coming from a perspective that is no longer applicable in the Anthropocene. This control perspective holds that the world is stable, that yes, systems are complicated, but we can break them down to their parts and understand them, that events are predictable, that humans are separate from nature. And this approach values an emphasis on utility and efficiency. But we're arguing that we need this entangled sets perspective, which holds that the world is rapidly changing, as I just said, that systems are complex, so that means we can't just put them together from the sum of the parts, but in fact, the interactions between different components of the system, feedbacks, nonlinearities, are things that make these systems behave in surprising ways. Events are uncertain. Humans and nature are inextricably linked. And this perspective values pluralism and diversity and flexibility in our solutions. So in summary, really, the control perspective holds that the social, ecological, and technological systems are isolated from each other and decoupled, whereas the SETS perspective holds that these systems are integrated. So the SETS framework, as it applies to cities, we recognize that urban resilience problems are problems of complexity. So we need this convergent framework. And that cities all have social, ecological, and technological elements that interact. Now, this is probably true of many other types of ecosystems as well. Think agroecosystems, for example, where these three domains are interacting. Urban resilience to extreme events, we think, emerges from the interactions and feedbacks among these domains. So if we want to move from this control perspective to this entangled sets perspective, we really need to think about the interaction of SE&T, and the diagram that you see on the upper right is intended to show that these intertwine or intertangling of sets, where the blue lines that cross this helix are our ongoing efforts to make sense of this complexity as it continues to evolve and respond to itself and to outside drivers and disturbances. So, in summary, building resilience means enhancing our capacities to adjust, adapt, and transform toward desired futures. So I'm going to illustrate the value of this SETS approach using a project that we conducted in UREX, assessing flood vulnerability in cities. And this is a project led by Heejin Chang, and offshoots of the project led by Jason Sauer and Arun Palathadka. And in this project, we set out to conduct a comprehensive comparison of vulnerability of 6 cities. And vulnerability here is a product of exposure and sensitivity, and inversely related to adaptive capacity. So for each of those 3 elements of vulnerability, we developed or identified indicators in each of the 3 domains, social, ecological, and technological, 2 for each. And these indicators were really based on data that we had available across the 6 cities that we used, and we calculated these indicators by census block group occurring in a 500-year floodplain. So I'm not going to show you all the data that came out of this project, but just really the main take-home points. And these are maps of 3 of the 6 cities. And what we're mapping is the top quartile of vulnerability. And the blue, green, and orange are the individual domain vulnerabilities, so social, ecological, and technological. And then the purple, pink, and brown colors and the black reflect overlaps between these. And what you can see in these 3 cities, Portland, Baltimore, and New York City, that there is very little overlap. There's some social technological overlap in New York and Portland. That's the pink, and some ecological technological overlap in New York and Baltimore. That's the brown. But in general, not very much overlap. And if we look at the other 3 cities, Miami, Atlanta, and Phoenix, again, we see some overlap in Phoenix for social ecological, the purple, and, the brown, and some social technological and even SET overlap in Miami and Atlanta. But in general, again, we don't see very much overlap. Thus, focusing on just 1 or 2 dimensions of sets will misrepresent vulnerability. And this is important because using the SETS approach helps us to learn where we should implement strategies to combat increased flooding in cities and what strategies should be used. Okay, now I want to talk about scenarios. The way we use the term scenario is a plausible and coherent narrative about the future of a place or situation. So this is different than a modeled scenario, for example. And these narrative scenarios are essentially tools to help envision what the future might look like given different circumstances and decisions that we make. As a part of the UREX SRN, we developed several scenarios for each of the cities, so between 4 and 7 scenarios for each city. We invited local stakeholders to participate in envisioning what their city would look like in 2080, and we asked them to come up with strategies along a timeline to get to that future vision. there are typically 5 or 6 different groups or tables at a workshop, each with a different theme to help guide the conversation. So those themes might be things like combating heat, combating flooding, but it could also be improving mobility in the city or innovation, sponsoring innovation. And I'll say a little more about the process later on. So our framework, the Sustainable Future Scenarios Framework, which I need to acknowledge David Iwaniak here, who invented this, it distinguishes transformative and adaptive scenarios, which are co-produced, and strategic scenarios that are based on existing goals and strategies. And cities often have in, for example, their general plans, some goals of things that they would like to accomplish in the next 5 or 10 years. And so we take those and we turn those into a strategic scenario to contrast with these more forward-looking, deep forward-looking, transformative and adaptive scenarios. And our goal in developing these scenarios is to inspire and promote transformative change, and that's probably the number one goal, to assess the desirability of alternative futures, to explore sets, interactions, conflicts, and trade-offs, so the kinds of conflicts that might happen between 2 different types of scenarios, to enhance decision-making capacity and guide long-term planning. We think this is an approach that could be used by planners in cities, and to link anticipatory knowledge to action. I think one of the best practices is engaging the co-production of knowledge and strategies. In the co-production is an important component of that, to further develop our innovative ideas that we may have about building resilience, but to understand what works and doesn't work in different communities and thus enhance the legitimacy and credibility of those solutions in order that they can be effective. So not all solutions are going to apply to all places, and so working directly with people in these communities helps us to understand the things that will work and won't work. So now we've been analyzing the data from these scenarios. The city teams have, in some cases, published these scenarios, but what we've been trying to do is take a bird's eye view, really, of the scenarios and what they're showing us. And so for these 60 scenarios, we identified 240 goals, so an average of 4 goals per scenario. And of those, about 73%, about 3/4, were deemed to be transformative for at least one of the domains of transformation, which you can see here. These domains include human-nature interactions or relationships, the building of infrastructure, sorry, I need to see this, managing and supporting transformative change for the human-made structures, governance. Often the aim here is to improve the representation, effectiveness, transparency, accountability, or responsiveness of government. Social justice, a fair and equitable distribution of resources, opportunities, and privileges within a society. And reformed markets. This is often referring to social, political, economic reorganizations that involve measures to shift economic forces to prioritize social justice, environmental sustainability, sort of a regenerative economy, if you will. And then finally, climate resilience, transformations that refer to comprehensive and systemic approaches that go beyond traditional one-off adaptation measures. So we found that these, again, as I said, 73% were deemed transformative, and many of these were transformative in more than just the one dimension. And the most common co-occurrences that you can see in the diagram at the right are human-nature relations with infrastructure futures, human-nature relations with climate resilience, infrastructure futures with climate resilience, and social justice with governance. So within the broad scenario goals, certain strategies reoccurred in many of the scenarios, and I love some of these. For example, a lot of the scenarios across the cities had this idea of having car-free cities, whole cities, or car-free zones, and walking around in Bordeaux. I can see that this has already been implemented in Bordeaux. It's really wonderful to be able to walk without seeing a car. Also, connecting green infrastructure. This is something that is using nature as part of the infrastructure of a city. A fundamental right to housing, healthcare, and water is common across all of these. And then one I love is water-based transportation. And this even appeared in scenarios for the Aridland cities that we had, using canals as transportation routes. Other strategies, though, were unique to a given place. And that reminds us that there's no singular strategy that will work in all locations. Oh, I just wanted to point out these I don't know if you can see them. Yeah, you can see them. So these are some of the strategies that one of the tables in one of the workshops actually put together. And they're things like 100% of urban-generated runoff is captured or harvested, developing a multi-scale neighborhood to regional floodplain network, centralized rain and gray water capture to support green infrastructure, and things like that. Okay, so with that overview of the scenarios at this sort of across 9 cities, I'm going to shift to a case study of Phoenix. Phoenix is a city in Arizona in the United States, the southwestern United States. And I want to illustrate with this the contradictions and trade-offs surrounding water, as well as the visioning processes at 2 different scales. So Phoenix is a very fast-growing southwestern city. It's in a hot, dry climate. Its population has grown more than tenfold in 70 years, and that growth is not slowing. So just to give you some personal perspective on this, I moved to Phoenix in 1978, and there were about 1 million people in the metropolitan area. So it's gone up 5 times in the time that I've lived there. So the Phoenix case study encompasses this period of explosive growth of modern Phoenix beginning in around 1955. But here I want to acknowledge that the myth of the Phoenix is just that, a myth. The Phoenix is a myth about a bird rising from the ashes of a previous civilization. But in fact, settler colonists did not arrive in the latter half of the 19th century to an empty landscape and build a city on the ashes of an ancient civilization. In fact, there was an ancient civilization, the Huhugam, who had a city of sorts here of as many as 10,000 residents. They built these canals that you see in the central map. And if you look on the bottom left of that map of the canals, you see South Mountain, which is the mountain that's jutting out sort of in the middle of the picture on the right. I think I might have a pointer here. Yeah. So this is South Mountain here, and this is approximately up here. So you see it covered a very large area of this region. They had an agrarian lifestyle with irrigation. They departed the area for reasons that are unclear in about 1400 Common Era after 2,000 years of continuous habitation. So that's not exactly a failed civilization, in my opinion. But when European settlers arrived in the late 1800s, there were people living there, descendants of the Huhugam, the Akimel-Atham, and also other tribes or indigenous nations who are still very much here. And European settler colonists displaced these indigenous communities and appropriated their lands to farm and build cities. So Phoenix was founded after the US Civil War, which is in 1865, based on irrigated agriculture. But growth really took off in the 1950s when boosters were promoting Phoenix as an oasis, when air conditioning was invented, and when Americans embraced the suburban lifestyle and its dependence on automobiles. So this city is a classic US Western city, it's very sprawled out. Lots of people have to drive cars to get anywhere. And so forth. To support originally the irrigated agriculture and later the municipal population, extensive modifications of hydrology occurred. So These include, at the hill slope scale in the bottom photographs, you can see interruptions of flow connections at the hill slope scale. At the scale of the whole city, we have these two rivers, the Verde and the Salt, coming together upstream from Phoenix. There are now 6 reservoir dams on those, and then a final diversion dam that you can see in the upper right photo here. This diversion dam takes all of the water in the Salt River and diverts it into a series of canals that then flow through the city here. And many of those canals are in the same location as the original Hohokam canals. And then finally, in 1994, a very large water project was completed, bringing water from the Colorado River, which is in the extreme northwest part of the state, down to central Arizona in this Central Arizona Project Canal. Oops. So today, people enjoy lush gardens and swimming pools. That photo on the upper right is an aerial photo where you can see all the swimming pools, owing to the capture of this water from the local watershed and also the Colorado River. We also manage stormwater extensively, and a lot of the work I've done has been focused on stormwater management. But there's also quite a lot of work that's been done on water supply. The water supply comes from the Colorado River, the surface water supply, and then groundwater, which is an unsustainable use of water for this region. So hydrologic modifications altered the kinds of flow paths that we see, as well as connectivity. And in this map that was created by one of my graduate students, you can see the teal colors are the modern canals. This is the Central Arizona Project Canal. The blue are the rivers. This one doesn't flow in the city any longer. The light teal color is the original Hohokam canals. And I'm going to focus on this watershed that you see here. This is the Indian Bend Wash watershed. It's effectively cut in half by the Central Arizona Project Canal. So this Phoenix, this watershed, you can see in the colors here on this map, has been reduced in size, the amount of land that is actually contributing flow to the river at its confluence with the Salt River. And there's a gradient of stormwater management types that occur in this small watershed. Actually, it's about 500 square kilometers, the entire watershed, so it's not tiny. And you can see above the Cap Canal, we have natural washes. That area, at least when this photograph was taken, was not very developed. But below the canal, we have a series of pervious channels, a section that has a lot of retention basins, and then a section that is older near the mouth of the Indian Bend Wash that is primarily street drainage and pipes. And work that Rebecca Hale did showed that this reduced connectivity associated with these pervious channels and washes and retention basins dramatically reduces the amount of water that flows out of those small watersheds. So the pipes are very conducive, very connected from impervious urban surfaces to the stream, and that runoff response is about 65% of the precipitation, probably with the rest of it evaporated, whereas the washes and wash and retention basins are much more able to retain that water, infiltrate into the ground, and ultimately potentially into groundwater. So I forgot to point out this watershed upstream here. In the orange is Sycamore Creek. This is an unmodified, spatially intermittent stream that drains about a 500 square kilometer watershed that I've been studying for about 45 years or so. And what we noticed when we first started looking at Indian Bend Wash is that a lot of the hydrographs are very flashy. They look like the hydrograph for Sycamore Creek. And this is not surprising in urban ecology, because the idea is that urban hydrology is the urban stream syndrome results in these very flashy hydrographs primarily because of the prevalence of impervious surfaces. So we wanted to ask, is this the case in these arid lands where you actually see these flashy hydrographs that are more flashy than rural environments. And in fact, we measured what's called the Richards-Baker Flashiness Index and showed that, in fact, as you increase development, you get less flashy streams in these arid lands compared to the urban stream syndrome, which is illustrated here by these North Carolina and Virginia streams that show a dramatic increase in flashiness as development proceeds. The reason for this is likely the increased use of retention basins, pervious channels, and other sorts of infiltration systems within the Phoenix metro area and other Tucson metro area as well that explain what this contradiction of the urban stream syndrome. Now moving up to the whole stream, Indian Bend Wash, for a larger scale example of the use of nature in stormwater management, we have this designed stream, or greenbelt, in Scottsdale, Arizona. The upper photo shows this ephemeral stream, which is prone to flash floods. The right photo in showing a flash flood in 1967, but the photo is from 1935 when it was mostly farmland. As development proceeded to occur, these floods became more and more of a problem. And so the city, in concert with the US Army Corps of Engineers, developed this plan for a greenbelt, which you see in the bottom photo on the left, and now this urbanization is complete around this area. And now when it floods, you have a system that basically just shows some debris that needs to be picked up, maybe some garbage cans that get tipped over and have to be picked up again, but really very little consequence. So this is an aerial view of the greenbelt, and you can see it's very wide. It has a number of parks and lakes and is an important recreational amenity for the city of Scottsdale, which is borders on both sides of this. But when it floods, it looks like this. So it basically fills up with water. And here, I want to contrast what this resilient solution or this nature-based solution contrasts with a traditional sort of control-based solution. And the idea of the control-based traditional solution is we want it to be fail-safe. So given that risk is a product of probability and consequence, we want to say there's a very low likelihood that this system will fail, but we know that if it does, there'll be a high consequence of failure. In contrast with a safe-to-fail system, it may fail more frequently. That means it may flood outside of its banks more frequently, but because it's parks and grass and so forth, there's minimal consequence. And so this system is more designed with nature. In addition to that ability to be flexible and deal with the potential for increased extreme events in this area and increased magnitude of those flash floods, the nature-based solution provides multiple ecosystem services. This was a project where we looked at ecosystem services of a bunch of different stormwater management systems, but this is just comparing this traditional solution with the solution that has a lot more potential for it's more aesthetically pleasing. It has habitat, biodiversity, regulates temperature, water quality, and provides for recreation. So flooding in Phoenix has occurred throughout history, and now we're back up to the scale of the Salt River, which is the big river that does not flow through Phoenix any longer. Just a quick story on this. The damaging floods have led to strong management activities and responses, but some of the responses by the city population have perpetuated existing inequities, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that story, and it focuses on these 1891 and 1905 floods. So I'm going to talk about South Phoenix. South Phoenix is an area of Phoenix that is south of the river, and it is a community that is a high percentage Hispanic and African American and relatively low income. South Phoenix once supported lush trees along these lateral canals, and many people lived along the river around the turn of the century. But in these big floods occurred, the wealthy white population moved north, but they restricted the movement of the Mexican immigrants and the black population to the area south of the river. And a phenomenon known as redlining, where people were restricted to particular areas and encouraged not to move to particular areas that were dominated by people of color, occurred as late as 1960. So you can see from this photograph on the environmental memories of South Phoenix that in 1915, it wasn't a bad place to be. But in the 1950s, there was this idea that we needed to get rid of trees because they were taking our water. And we needed to bury the canals because they were evaporating too much water. So the canals were buried, the trees were removed, and as a result, this area became extremely dry and one of the hottest areas of the city. And so right now, vegetation is a really important control on, when you're in a dry climate and you get in the shade, it makes a huge difference. And you can see the difference in surface temperature in the graphic on the lower left between a bare surface and a vegetated surface is quite substantial. But the map that you see on the right is the map of heat vulnerability, and there's been quite a lot of work on heat in Phoenix. And where it relates to water is that water is the thing that allows for vegetation to grow and allows for a much cooler climate. In some areas of Phoenix that have a lot of vegetation, the maximum temperatures can be as much as 7 degrees centigrade lower than in some of these hotter areas. So the area I've outlined there with high heat vulnerability is the South Phoenix area. We also found, and this is in the chart here, is an exposure to high heat work done by Sharon Harlan, showing that in a 4-day high heat event, those that were exposed to the highest degree were significantly lower income and higher percentage minority than those that were under low or medium exposure to high heat. So this is the background. I hope I've convinced you that water is essential for the Phoenix lifestyle, but its distribution is often inequitable, resulting in disparities in extreme heat exposure, and that flooding is a problem that has been dealt with in some creative ways. So I want to turn now to our work on futures. I'd like to acknowledge the many people who have contributed to the Phoenix future scenarios. These pictured are our research team on the right and our practitioner team, on the left, and the practitioner team on the right, but also recognizing over 100 participants in these scenario workshops and various students that helped out with the project as well. To begin this work, we conducted surveys of nearly 300 practitioners and researchers from this area. These are stakeholders and decision makers from government, both city government, county government, state government, even federal, academia, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, business leaders in the Phoenix area. And this word cloud reflects the most common concerns about the Phoenix future from those surveys. Not surprisingly, water is number one. And then this SET's Venn diagram shows the top strategies that those surveyed recommended to deal with 3 types of extreme events. And these are just the 4 or 5 top strategies that were suggested across the survey respondents. And you can see that these different strategies are distributed in the ecological, technological, and social domain relatively evenly, but there's not very much overlap in fewer ecological, technological, or social technological strategies, and no set strategies. The asterisks here are mostly to point out that the city, people responding to this, are thinking about nature-based solutions. So in our scenario work, small groups of participants start off, I'm going to go through this. They start off by looking at the major historical events, some of the things I talked about earlier, and decisions that have led us to where we are today. They then ask themselves what a resilient, sustainable, and just city would look like in the year 2080. So based on this, each group comes up with overarching goals and objectives, and I talked about those at the larger scale earlier, that would need to be met to bring about that future. They then delve into specific detailed strategies and actions that are needed to achieve those objectives, asking where these strategies need to occur in their city, by when does it have to happen, who needs to make it happen, what are the institutional barriers that need to be overcome, and who benefits from these strategies. And then a very fun activity at the end of the workshop is that each group develops a day in the life narrative for someone living in their city, their vision in 2080. And they got quite creative with these. Many people put together little skits of their futures, and it was pretty interesting. As I said, we do these scenarios for Phoenix at 2 scales, the regional scale, which is the red in the map on the left, and you can see the little red dot in the south center of Arizona, which is where this large county is located. And then the local or village scale is the South Mountain Village, or South Phoenix, that I was talking about earlier. I don't have time to go through every one of these scenarios, but these are the scenarios that came through and some of the renderings of the visions that were done. On the left, you have the regional visions. On the right, you have the village scale visions. We have adaptive scenarios, for example, the true cost of water on the regional visions, the some like it hot scenario in the village visions that deals with heat. And then transformative scenarios, the Emerald City in the regional scale, the mountain to river scenario in the village scale. And let's just look at that one, the mountain to river theme. This was created because South Phoenix is located between South Mountain, that I pointed to on the map earlier, and the Salt River. And it's iconic because South Mountain has these TV towers that you see in the drawing there, that the river is there, they're aware of it, but there are many places where you can't access the river at all. So they developed goals that were that development should recognize a community-held, environmentally, historically, and culturally sensitive vision, that watershed management should reduce risk and hazard while providing beneficial use, so multifunctionality of stormwater management, and that eco-hydrological connectivity between the mountain and river should align with human mobility and access to both the mountain and the river. And you can just see some of the strategies. They envisioned having flow back in the Salt River instead of having a dry riverbed, having various connecting corridors between the mountain and the river, and then local features like bioretention. So for these local workshops, the output was interesting. They produced these tangible futures, 5 of them. In all of them, honoring place and a concern for equity were really key elements. And then we have these workshop data, maps, stories, all kinds of things that can be used by researchers, design students, modelers, planners. And in fact, I think this kind of approach is one that should be adopted by planning departments in cities. But what you see here are 2 renditions of some ideas that came out of a design studio at Arizona State University. And you can see on the bottom right is an expo that the students put on with the designs that they had created from those village scenarios. So in further analyses, we have continued to look at the data that we have and do analyses on them. This is an example of looking at future ecosystem services associated with nature-based solutions. So we did code recordings and notes from each of the scenarios at the village scale. And then we asked what kind of urban ecological infrastructure or nature-based solution, green, brown, blue, turquoise, the colors, as you can imagine, have to do with the greening and vacant land, lakes, streams, and ponds, and wetlands. And then asked further what ecosystem services were envisioned to result from those. And just very quickly, this is for the 5 scenarios that we see in the village scenarios. And what's notable here is that most of the scenarios wanted mostly green nature-based solutions, but the mountain to river, as well as the connected and mobile, also included rivers, streams, ponds, and wetlands in their vision, so the blue mark. The ecosystem services that were envisioned are not particularly surprising. For the heat scenario, regulating services, the ability of vegetation to ameliorate extreme heat were really important. And for the equity district scenario, the provisioning of food, the dealing with food security issues in this area were very important ecosystem services. We did a follow-up with some folks from the workshop, asking them, using a Q-sort methodology, what they would see as the priorities for the ecosystem services in today and in 2080. And what I want to point out here that I think is quite interesting is that the view of the water issues for 2080 become really important. So you see a real big increase in prioritization of water purification and freshwater supply. You see no change in the already high priority of local climate regulation. This is a hot place, and people really do care about that. And then, of course, because something has to go down, we see a loss or a downgrading of cultural ecosystem services in this group. Now, to get to the regional scenarios, I like to use an example that contrasts the adaptive drought and transformative Emerald City scenario to see how we can use these products that come out of these workshops. The true cost of water is really focused on banking water for long-term water security and conservation of water, whereas the transformative Emerald City scenario is focused more on balancing the targets for flood, drought, and heat. And in the Emerald City, there are things like repurposed freeways, hubs of green that are connected where canals and freeways cross, water harvesting to support green hubs, and so forth. And if we take the results from this workshop, where we have mapped out what these scenarios would look like in the Phoenix region, you can see that they're really quite different between these two scenarios, very contrasting. So the true cost of water scenario is really collapse the city down, highly densified urban environment, not very much green, reduction in agricultural areas, which are the orange. Whereas a transformative Emerald City looks a lot greener. It's not uniformly green. As I said, the green is located at the intersections of canals and highways, but it just looks a lot greener, doesn't it? And so we were able to feed this information, the spatial information, into the weather research and forecasting model to actually predict heat outcomes of these different scenarios. And you can see that these are just heat outcomes with temperature relative to some base. And you can see that indeed the saving of water results in a much hotter situation than a situation that we have in the Emerald City scenario. But of course, there's a trade-off associated with this, right? Water use to support vegetation means that water is largely going to evapotranspiration. And so if we model using WaterSim, which is a model developed specifically for this region, the banking of water across this region, you can see that the adaptive drought scenario is doing a good job of saving water and much less. So these things have to be considered when decision makers are considering the kinds of futures that they want to see. How am I doing on time? Okay? No one knows. Okay. No one's getting up to leave, so I'll just keep going. I have a few more slides. I wanted to point to a qualitative assessment that we did comparing scenarios at 2 different scales. So we find there are differences in what is valued and desired for the future between these 2 different scenario groups. At the local scale, there's more emphasis on normative elements. What do we want? Social equity and participatory governance and a sense of place. In the regional scale, there's more emphasis on ecological values and design. And I'm going to show you more of the data. The middle one is, this is resilience, equity, and sustainability, and different metrics of those that are that these different scenarios are categorized in. And the thing to point out is that in the resilience category, governance participation scores really high in the local scenario. All of these elements of equity score really high in the local scenario. And again, participatory governance scores really high in the local scenario. And then we are also able to contrast individual scenarios that are on the same theme. So the top 3 are resilience, equity, and sustainability for heat scenarios, and the bottom 3 are resilience, equity, and sustainability measures for the flood scenarios. So what we can see is that they're really different between these 2 areas. So these local and regional workshops produce tangible futures. And I've just gone over what the main differences were. But even within the same city, the values differ. So context is really important for these. These have to be place-based scenarios in order to really fit the place that we're looking for. So this, we hope, builds anticipatory and transformative capacity in these communities and in the decision makers of each local area. I just want to say a few things about nature-based solutions. As you can see, there were quite a few. There was a lot of interest in nature-based solutions across the scenarios. And so we really have the question of whether nature-based solutions can build sets resilience to floods, extreme heat, and other extreme events. We've been working on this as an outgrowth of the UREX project. We built another network looking at nature-based solutions. You all have probably seen this. This is the IUCN definition of nature-based solutions. Important point is they're solving societal problems while also addressing biodiversity concerns. So as an outgrowth of UREX, we formed this nature-based solutions for urban resilience in the Anthropocene network of networks. And the really wonderful thing is that this kind of work is going on all over the world. So the challenges may differ, and we're exchanging information and sharing knowledge with other researchers in 9 world regions. So I invite you to learn more if you're interested. Our website, shown on the left there, the QR code should lead to that. And then there's a special feature in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science that came out this summer on nature-based solutions in urban environments. So all the work I presented today is about bringing nature into the city, integrating ecological with social and technological domains to build resilience of desirable states, to improve the chances for ensuring that our cities in the future are places where people can thrive in a rapidly changing world. So thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup Nancy. On a décidé de terminer à 18h15, du coup on a 10 minutes pour échanger avec Nancy. On va commencer par des échanges avec Nancy si vous avez des questions. Et puis après il y a les traducteurs de toute façon qui vont arrêter, le traiteur qui va arriver, donc il va falloir qu'on libère la salle. Donc est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans la salle? Yes.
Well, hi, Nancy. Thanks a lot, Pascal. I was wondering, in your consultation, how did you manage the representativeness
Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, hi. How did you manage to have a good representation of the various population and stakeholders of the territory? Well, how did you do, and how did you ensure that maybe the pressure, rapport de force, on dit comment ça? Le rapport de force.
How did we put together the teams in the workshops to do the scenarios?
No. The population, the participants. How did you ensure that the participants who came were representative of the different types of populations and interest?
Okay, thank you. So we focused particularly the regional scenarios in Phoenix and most of the scenarios in the other cities on decision makers. So we were looking to bring people together who were in positions of making decisions about infrastructure changes, various things like that. So city officials, people from different departments in the city, county and state and federal. We did invite some business leaders, and that varied across the cities. But we were not focused until we got to the village scenarios in Phoenix. We were really focused on the general population. So we basically, when we did the survey, for example, in Phoenix, we hit about 300 people. And we asked at the end of the survey if they would be interested in participating in a scenario exercise where they could develop the scenarios. And so we chose from those people who had indicated interest. We also used snowball sampling in that to suggest that they send the survey on to other folks in their orbit. So as far as ensuring representativeness, we were not, as I said, we were not in most cases trying to represent the public at large. We were more interested in the people that were making decisions in each of these cities. Does that answer your question? Yes, thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you very much for the presentation. What kind of water would be used for these green green infrastructure projects? Would it compete against human consumption? And are these projects going to increase the availability of water for human consumption or going to limit it?
Okay, so there's a lot in that, and I can go on and on about water in Phoenix and how we handle all this. But I would say, first of all, that in the scenario where we had a lot of green, what was modeled was the capture of stormwater and storage and then reuse for watering. So that was what enabled that green. And a lot of stormwater now, you have these flash floods, right? And a lot of it just goes downstream. So the idea is how much can we capture and use for that? There are other sources of water. For instance, Phoenix actually has some little residential lakes, craziest thing ever, but there they are. Originally, some of these neighborhoods that have lakes in them were built using drinking water to fill the lakes. This is no longer legal, and now they have to use treated wastewater for those lakes. There is a fair amount of reuse of treated wastewater in many cities in the United States, actually, where that technology is happening. Let's see, what else did I want to say? Finally, the big picture on water is, and this, we're probably past the point where it was no longer of concern, but because much of the Phoenix area originally was agriculture, as that converts to residential landscapes, there's much less water use associated with per hectare water use associated with residents than there is with farming, irrigated agriculture. And so over time, as this land conversion has happened, there's been more water available that wouldn't be available if there was an increase in irrigated farming, because we are actually seeing big reductions in the water sources, the water supply from snowpack, groundwater, etc. So at least at the moment, with as much as Venus has expanded, it's expanded at the expense of agriculture, which has resulted in the conversion of those water uses from irrigated agriculture to domestic use. There's a lot there, but the simple answer for the scenario I showed you at the end was the reuse of the storage and use of stormwater.
Merci. On va prendre une dernière question, et puis après on aura quelques petites annonces à faire.
I'm Sarah. Thank you very much for your presentation and all this research. Actually, I had two questions, but I'm going to try to be quick. The first one is you mentioned very well how, in fact, social inequalities have influenced the construction of the urban scape. And so I was wondering how these issues were tackled or handled within the scenarios. Let's say when doing the work for the future. I mean, how was this connected? And then I was wondering if there were forms of dissensus when discussing and debating the scenarios and the solutions, and if yes, how did you handle them? Thank you.
Okay, so for the first question, which is how did we handle these obvious inequities that existed? In the case of the local scenarios, let me close this so I can see you. In the case of the local scenarios, we were working deliberately with one of the most underserved populations in the Phoenix area. When we were putting together the themes that we were going to use, we actually had a pre-workshop, World Cafe, we called it, and they came up with the idea of creating an equity district, and that was one of the themes. So how would we actually take this whole district and be aware of the harms that have been done in the past and try to redress those harms? So that was actually an entire theme, an entire scenario at the local scale. At the regional scale, my memory is that the conversation, it came up a lot. So particularly when you're drawing the maps about where you want these different solutions or strategies to be implemented, there was a lot of concern about putting those in places that needed them the most. As to the second question, I'm forgetting what it was. Oh, yes, conflicts that arise during the discussions. We actually had a floating person who would, the facilitators for each group would sort of alert this floating person who was very good at conflict resolution whenever there was something that came up that was a conflict. So we tried to do that in all of the workshops that we had. One of the observations I would make, though, is particularly in the workshops that involved a lot of different city departments and city and state personnel, they were not accustomed to talking to each other. I mean, we've heard this morning about some of the problems with siloing and in bureaucracy, and these people were not that accustomed to working together and talking together about a future. And it was really wonderful to see, because a lot of them said, this is just the best thing, that we're actually able to talk to the people in parks, or able to talk to the people in the streets department, the stormwater department. And another thing I think that really liberated them to some extent is, instead of putting together the general plan for the next 5 years, they're looking at 2080. And they're liberated from, we can't do that because we're not allowed to do that. We wouldn't be able to change things fast enough. So they look at 2080 and say, this is what we want it to look like. And that means that by 2060, we need to have changed this. And by 2040, we need to have changed this. And these are the people that need to be involved in that change. So I think there's two answers. I mean, we had this sort of conflict resolution thing, but I think overall it was a much more engaging process for people, because they were able to really think outside the box, transformatively.
Many thanks. So I would like to thank again Nancy for this very stimulating talk.